Welcome in. It is Big Ten Today on a Thursday. We are presented by Rally House. Dave Revson, Rick Pizzo, Jake Butt. We're 2 weeks in. It's not too early to draw some conclusions, fellas.
I think that's fair to say. Always good to work the three-man weave, especially with a guy who's been on the road watching these teams in person, which I'm sure helps give you a true assessment of where they rank amongst each other inside the Big Ten.
You can't lie to the game. The film doesn't lie. The eye in the sky doesn't lie. So I got all my reasoning and my takes lined up, guys. I'm going to present to you the truth.
Wow. The truth.
The truth as I see it.
Hour. Yeah.
So I guess that would be opinion.
The truth with an asterisk. I think I like your initial. Yeah. I like your initial stance.
I think the timing of that is interesting following this week's presidential debate, but I'll just leave it at that.
Let's get to our big story, and it is some of the news and notes throughout the Big Ten early on. Ohio State's been utterly dominant. Average margin of victory, 51 points. Different story for Oregon. They've eked out 2 wins, dropped 6 spots in the AP poll. USC has looked great, including a signature win against LSU. And the Huskers may just be back into the poll this week at number 23, their top spot in 8 years. And Jake, I know you wanted to separate them out today, not so much in a power ranking, because it is really early, and you may be splitting hairs between who's 3 and who's 4 and who's 5. But you feel like there are some tiers that have already emerged. Yeah. So give us a sense of what Tier 1, Tier 2 look like for you.
Okay, yeah. So we could start there. The obvious one is Ohio State, right? That's obviously, you know, they're in their own category. We'll talk about that in a second. But then you roll down the list, and these are in no order. USC, Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, and Nebraska. I am ready to put them in that second tier. We'll talk about them in a second, but to me, it's those teams separated towards the top of the conference with a further separation of the Buckeyes.
I think that second tier really is fascinating because how do you separate them based on the teams that they've played? They've played very different schedules. They've looked very different, but I think we're all in agreement right now with your Tier 1. Tier 1 includes one school. It was the school that we thought would be the best coming in, and obviously Ohio State has separated itself from Oregon, who most of us thought would be that second school, if not a school challenging Ohio State for supremacy in the Big Ten.
If you just think about what teams you feel comfortable and confident saying this is a team that can win a national title this year, I do think it's Georgia, it's Texas, and it's Ohio State. Like right now, you're most confident that the national champion will come from those teams. We don't need to talk about how talented Ohio State is. Duh, they're Ohio State. They're talented at every position. But there's a few key notes that I learned last week on the call that I think are going to allow them to elevate. Number one, Ryan Day giving up play calling duties to Chip Kelly. Okay, not only does he trust his play caller, but Chip Kelly is a guy that's extremely creative. He could be lazy and run the ball up the middle and throw the ball on screens to Jeremiah Smith. They'd put up 40 points a game. But it's the creativity. He's forcing you to defend the whole width of the field and the length of the field, and anyone can score at any given time. But then Ryan Day, that allows him to get in the face of the offensive line, make sure they're more physical. They've upgraded their punt return game. The defense has taken that stride to say, we need takeaways, we need passion, we need emotion. And then just talking to these players, this is a group of guys that has smelled victory but haven't tasted at the highest level, right? They've lost to Michigan. They barely lost to Georgia on a field goal. This group collectively has come back with a decision already made going back to January. They will not be denied from victory. They're here to win at the highest level.
I'm interested in what you said about Chip Kelly and kind of what he has done here offensively early on. What's the balancing act, Jake? Because I think we're all thinking about that game on October 12th in Eugene against Oregon. What's the balancing act between putting a lot of different stuff on tape and making Dan Lanning and company prepare for that? Again, not to overlook the games between now and then, but clearly that's a big one, versus holding some stuff back and saying, hey, we don't want him to see the full arsenal.
So I'll just use one play to just kind of give you an example of their offense where it's one play, but it could be Judkins carrying the ball. It could be Will Howard keeping the ball. It could be Carnell Tate or Ibuka getting the ball, or Jeremiah Smith. It starts with a read option, so he can give it to Judkins or pull it. And in this game last week versus Western Michigan, Will Howard pulls it. Then all of a sudden the defense has to say, we got to stop the quarterback run. As soon as they come up, he dumps it out to Jeremiah Smith. All of a sudden, there's so much space because they're defending everything. 5-yard hitch turns into a 60-yard touchdown. So one play forces you to defend 5 or 6 elements. That's a base RPO scheme that is a complex play to defend.
And I think if anything is being held back right now, it may be that quarterback run game. We saw Will Howard. He was able to do that with a ton of success at K-State. There's no need to put him in that position right now. If you don't need to, you probably need to against Oregon. You probably need to against Michigan. So maybe Chip Kelly decides to slide it in when you get to those tougher opponents. So we have our Tier 1, which we are all, I believe, in agreement on. Tier 2, as I said, I think is fascinating to try to separate these teams. And we'll start with USC. And this is a great team to start with because they were in the top 25 preseason. And yet, Jake, there were so many questions. How would Miller Moss do replacing Caleb Williams? Would Dan Lynn really be as big a difference maker as Lincoln Riley expected him to be? Through 2 weeks, so far, so good.
Yeah, and they have the most impressive win in the conference by far, beating LSU to open that season. And there's a few things. You want to confirm some things, and then you want to see, to your point, Danton Lynn, what the defense looks. I wanted to confirm what I believe to be true, that if Lincoln Riley's calling plays, the offense is going to look phenomenal. Miller Moss is going to look phenomenal. Well, he did, and I actually think Miller Moss provides some things that Caleb Williams doesn't. I think Caleb Williams was so talented that he kind of did his own thing a few times. Whereas Miller Moss, I look at him as an extension of Lincoln Riley. In the biggest moments, he looked poised, comfortable, and he's been spreading the ball across the field. But then you look at the defense, and this is where we can draw conclusions now 2 weeks into the season. That is a different brand of USC Trojan defense. Physical. LSU has a great offensive line. They have 2 first-round tackles. Their linebackers, defensive line, was putting LSU on their back, tackling at a high level. I go back to their strength program. They've added 1,600 collective pounds this offseason. Yes, it's 2 games. They didn't have 2 games that looked like that last year.
I would agree with that. I think the one thing that gave me a little bit of pause is you always look after week 2 and say, what did the week 1 opponents do in week 2? And LSU didn't tear it up offensively against Nicholls State. In fact, they were under 400 yards total offense. They had fewer yards against Nicholls State than they had against USC. I'm not saying that this hasn't been transformed because we know Danton Lynn's track record. We saw what he did at UCLA last year. Again, maybe LSU isn't going to be. They're clearly not going to be what they were last year because they were the most potent
It will
offense
still be
in the
a good win at the end of the year.
100%. 100%. I'm not in any way minimizing the win. What I'm saying is how good is LSU's offense? I don't know. We'll find out. But I think what's really encouraging about USC, after watching them the last couple of years and kind of getting ready for them to come into the Big Ten, is fundamentally they're so much better on defense. Like you can throw all the statistics away and just say, like, are they in the right place and do they make the tackle? And that's a huge, huge difference.
I can count on one hand, just watching LSU's defense last year, I can count on one hand the number of times they put someone on their back and won with physicality and violence. That showed up all over the tape from LSU. LSU plays South Carolina on the road this weekend, College Day. We're going to learn a lot about LSU, therefore learning a lot about USC.
And USC ran the ball extremely well against Utah State, which they didn't necessarily do because they didn't have to do against LSU, and they needed to throw it because of what LSU was doing. I think that's a very good sign as well for the Trojans.
Yeah, that was really cool, the ground and pound Lincoln Riley offense. But it was interesting because they won the game against LSU with a run game for Woody Marks, but didn't really run it well and made a concerted effort to run it there in game 2. The next team you had in Tier 2 was Penn State, and they are a fascinating team because everyone knew what needed to happen for Penn State to take that next jump, that next step here. They needed to be more explosive on offense. Early returns really good under Andy Kotelnicki. What do you make of what you've seen from them through 2 weeks?
Well, this was an obvious choice. They're always going to be in that tier that's competing at the highest level for the Big Ten Conference. And they had an impressive win on the road, West Virginia, week 1. And I look at last week where it was a tale of 2 halves. They came out really slow. And I can say on one end that feels immature for them to be sleepwalking after a big win. A team like that should dominate if they want to take the next step. But I also say that's maturity then to have your back against the wall and be struggling and make halftime adjustments to then go out and win a game in the second half. Defense, cool, check, all good. Offense, we'd watch them last year, and it was like you'd forget to breathe watching them. There was just no space. Everything felt hard. You got those 2 running backs, and gosh, they're explosive. But they didn't have any room to move around last year. it feels easy and effortless, and we're seeing Drew Aller and his arm talent start to open up. Singleton's back breaking out runs. Allen is explosive. So everything you wanted to see offensively has been put on tape by Anthony Kotelnicki's offense.
Yeah, now, James Franklin probably would disagree with this statement. You could argue that every now and then playing that way and getting a scare, but getting a win early in the year, especially when you head into a bye, and then you have a similar team next weekend, a Kent State team that is not very good, that Penn State should probably beat by 30 or 40 points. From a schedule perspective, it allows you to teach, go back and look at what was wrong before the schedule gets a lot harder. And it's interesting because I think you could say the same thing about the next team in your Tier 2, and that's Oregon, because there have been so many teaching moments right now for Dan Lanning and a team that had so much hype coming in from the moment they put the duck into the White River in Indianapolis until the season kicked off. All anybody was talking about was how good Oregon was going to be. They may get there, but let's be honest, they haven't looked that part in the first 2 weeks.
And they haven't looked that part in every way. But when Dylan Gabriel has a clean pocket and he's throwing out to Tez Johnson or Evan Stewart or Terrence Howard or Terrence Ferguson, their tight end, okay, yeah, you know what? They can spread the ball around. They look good when things are clean. But
Terrence Howard, really talented,
Yes.
not so much at football.
Yes, exactly. But, you know, I like my tight end, so I'll give some credit to Terrence Ferguson. Sorry, buddy. But, you know, to win in the Big Ten and to win at the highest level, I look at the national championship last year. Washington won the Joe Moore Award, played Michigan, Joe Moore Award finalists. Michigan, Georgia, the teams that have dominated the past 3 years, all Joe Moore Award finalists. Oregon has to win in the trenches. Their offensive line has to play better. And I look at the way Boise State was able to run the ball on them last week. Yeah. They were not gap sound. They were not tackling well. Oregon State is 5th nationally in rushing offense right now, which is 1 spot ahead of Boise State. This is a rivalry game. We're going to learn a lot about the Ducks this week.
One thing I'll say, I think Ashton Jeanty is a fabulous running back. I was blown away watching him on Saturday. I think he might win the Doak Walker Award. So I get that you're going up against a really good back, but both lines of scrimmage, no doubt, like those are concerns for Oregon here early on. I want to get to your next Tier 2 team. It is Nebraska. And we were actually talking about this before we went on the air. And Nebraska's tricky here because I think everyone wants them to be good. I mean, maybe everyone except for, you know, a few isolated fan bases.
Probably not in Denver.
Throughout the Big Ten. Yeah, there are a few places that don't want to be good. But it would be so good for the league were Nebraska to be the powerhouse that they once were, even somewhat close to that. Colorado's just not a good football team. So how much do you read into that? Are we putting too much on what we've seen here through the first 2 weeks, or is Nebraska really at a level where they're a top 25 team in the country?
Well, they're a different team, and Colorado wasn't a good team last year, and Nebraska still turned the ball over and gave that game away.
We thought they were good when they played last year. Yeah, but they proved to not be good.
Exactly. Yeah. And Nebraska, I don't actually think they've been a bad team in recent history. I think they've turned the ball over more than anyone, which makes it absolutely impossible to win these games. Tony White had a top 20 defense last year. Like, this defense is stout. They got pressure on Shedeur Sanders on 22 dropbacks last week. They only sent 4 or less guys on 19 of those. So they're organically making quarterbacks comfortable without leaving themselves vulnerable. And then through 2 weeks, this is the biggest difference. Through 2 weeks last year, they were -7 in turnovers. This year, they're +3. So that's a 10 turnover swing. Like, that is not an accident. That is a huge data outlier that we have to acknowledge. They prioritized all offseason taking care of the football, and they have a young quarterback that gets it. He has not put that team in harm's way. So to me, I know the defense can take them home, one of the best defenses in the conference, but they're showing everything I want to see offensively for me to believe in them.
And if they're going to go organically the rest of the year, they better get that NIL money. Everything organic, always more expensive. But so far, absolutely working for the Huskers. Finally, let's touch on your alma mater and Michigan. It's kind of the converse or inverse conversation to what we were just discussing with Nebraska and Colorado. Yes, Michigan got thumped, but Texas isn't just good. Texas is really good. Texas is national championship good. So how does that affect the way that we should think of the Wolverines?
It should affect. Texas is going to make a lot of teams look like that. And Fresno State is a team that could make a run, win their conference, and they could be a playoff team. Like, they have that level of talent. So this week is particularly important as it's a fork in the road for Michigan. Because, yes, they have first-round talent all over the defense. But that's not the brand of football we're accustomed to seeing. Yep. Tackling, assignment responsibility, that is not a championship standard. The defense has to play better. On the offensive side of the ball, you just look across the board and say, before we even talk about Davis Warren, the winning formula is up front. They have not been explosive in the run game. Bottom third of the FBS in runs of 10-plus yards, run of 20-plus yards. There's no space. They feel like Penn State last year. They're playing Arkansas State, who has struggled to stop the run. They're undisciplined defensively. So though I see it on tape, I'm not panicking watching Michigan. It's close, but close doesn't get it done in football. You have to put it on tape for that to become who you are.
I'm fascinated to see if Jack Tuttle plays this weekend. Sharon Moore in his news conference said the quote was he should be ready
He's ready.
to go.
Yeah.
So do you play him? Does that overly complicate what's already a difficult situation? Because quarterback is an issue. As you mentioned, offensive line is an issue. Like, it's not the only issue. But if you feel like you need a little bit more of a dynamic passing game, Jack Tuttle has some experience in college football. We've seen he can throw the ball a little bit. He's got some mobility as well. I don't know.
Early season quarterback changes, always dicey. Northwestern's making one this week as well.
Michigan is not in Tier 2 because they're going to have an elite passing game. They weren't a national champion last year because they were the most explosive. They have got to block better and dominate up front. That's why, and I believe they have the capability.
Have to figure out a way to get better, for sure. You've got USC next week, so
not a lot of time.
No, they have to be better than they've been so far.
Welcome back to Big Ten Today. Rick Pizzo, Dave Revson, Jake Budd, as we continue our conversation about Big Ten football cut into tiers. We now move into the third tier, and we start with one of the new arrivals in Washington. I love Jedd Fisch's approach from the very start. He was open, honest, said, I'm not sure what we have.
Yeah.
We are rebuilt. Yes, I brought some guys with Arizona, but this is not. It is nothing like the team that played for the national title a year ago. Will Rogers transfers in from Mississippi State. Through 2 weeks, I know they haven't played tough competition, but I think they've done exactly what Coach Fisch has wanted them to do.
Absolutely. And, coaching wins in the Big Ten Conference, coaching wins in football in general. And as I start to look at this, I think this might be one of the best staffs across the conference. Jedd Fisch is the head coach. Who wins at Arizona the way he did? Not many. Many have tried and many have fallen short. You bring in Steve Belichick to shore up the defense. Belichick, defense, good. I'm good with that, right? Brendan Carroll to shore up the offensive line. Their staff has a ton of NFL experience. We know the names from last year that left better than these new names, but maybe we should get to know Will Rogers because he's played a ton of football. Maybe we should get to know Jonah Coleman, one of my favorite players in the conference. Ephesians Prysock, their 6'4" corner. They have some playmakers. We're jumping the gun a little bit going into week 3, but this is a revealing weekend here as you play in the Apple Cup. We're going to learn a lot about them this weekend.
No doubt. We're going to learn a lot about Washington. We're going to learn a lot about Oregon as well this weekend. But 46 new scholarship players, that is not easy to do. And he has done a really nice job. As you said, he was the first to tell you, I don't know. I'm going to wait and see what it looks like when they're sweating next to one another. And it's been pretty good so far.
And from all reports, he's also a guy, Dave, that has his finger in a little bit of everything with this program. He's worried about, like, the scoreboard and the stats guy and making sure that the chain gang is up to par. I mean, he is one of those detail-oriented guys. That's what you have to do when you have a roster like this.
He donated $1 million of his own dollars to the NIL collective. That's called putting your money where you like. That's how you buy over or win over your locker room and your staff.
Love it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Rutgers here. There was so much excitement about Rutgers heading into this year. They have absolutely lived up to it. Again, level of competition. You can raise your questions about that, and that's fair. But man, early on, Rutgers has answered any questions we might have had about them.
And another revealing game this weekend, going on the road, tough environment at Virginia Tech. But gosh, when you watch the tape, that you can still see technique, fundamentals, awareness, football IQ. That offensive line's, I think it's top 5 highest graded in college football per PFF. That's great because you have the second leading rusher in the FBS in Kyle Monungai, the leading rusher in the Big Ten. Did we doubt him? Did we doubt that this is what he could do? He looks even better than last year, and we know how good he was. And then he's running with more space because all of a sudden, here comes Callie McManus looking like he's having the best season of his career. So across the board,
the Kirk Shiraka effect is real, ladies and gentlemen.
And he knows Kirk Shiraka, right? Like these are the things we anticipated we'd see, and they're putting on tape earlier in the year. And I give Greg Schiano a ton of credit. We can't talk about coaching in absolute. Like, we can't judge Rutgers wins versus Ohio State and Michigan. But what he's done in that program, calling it a developmental program, finally he has a veteran team. Well, then this has to be the year for a developmental program to put it on tape, and they've done it.
Oh, they absolutely have. That Virginia Tech game next weekend, bye week this week for Rutgers. But that is the next game, to your point. And that's going to be a great measuring stick. I mean, Virginia Tech's not a great team. I get that. They went to Vanderbilt and lost in the opener, but Lane Stadium is not an easy place
Tough environment
to play.
It's funny, we were having a conversation in the green room last week asking what was the last game you saw as a fan. Mine was actually at Lane Stadium some 20 years ago when they played Texas A&M. And I'm not so sure since then I've ever been to a louder stadium.
Loud.
It is unbelievable.
And
they play
Tender
Metallica
Sandman.
as they come into the stadium. It is an unbelievable environment. That's what Rutgers will face after a bye week. As for Illinois, I love what Brett Bielema is doing with this team early. Brett said Luke Altmaier will be much better. He's in Barry Lundy's offense, the second year. He's comfortable. Aaron Henry's not the new guy on the block as DC. Aaron Henry allegedly watched game film of the loss to Kansas from last year over 100 times before this past Saturday's matchup. It showed in the way that defense played.
That's what we call a football guy right there, man.
100 times.
Someone who just is mad at himself, like masochistic.
And then you got your defense playing like it. And you got Xavier Scott playing like it, showing up and stuffing the stat sheet across the board. And okay, we thought we expect Luke Altmaier to look good, but then I look at the skill positions. I say Pat Bryant and Zachary Franklin. Like, where would you rank the receiver room across the Big Ten? It's in that top half for sure, and climbing and climbing and climbing. They got talent. And I think for Barry Lundy Jr., he was a guy that was that RPO system. And a few years ago with Chase Brown, a lot of their offense was within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. Now you got these big, tall, long receivers, and they can stretch you vertically, which is helping everybody out. I think they could even find more balance and more success running the football, which will benefit them. But again, an impressive win versus a formidable opponent that checked every box we wanted to see to start to believe in Illinois.
Honestly, like for me, it just boils down to 2 years ago when they were really good, they were third in the nation in turnover margin. Last year they were 122nd. This year they're tied for first.
That's it. And Brett will tell you that. He'll tell you that in special teams will be good.
Not giving the ball to the other team. Yeah, that's a really good strategy. You have Iowa in Tier 3. It's kind of been a mixed bag through 2 weeks. How do you assess the Hawkeyes, and why do you think they're still at that level?
It's hard to assess them, because I still believe in this defense, and I think the defense and Phil Parker will keep them in every game. They're never a team you feel good about playing. But the way they lost this Iowa State game makes me a little bit uneasy about having them in Tier 3. I did not expect them to give up that many explosive plays defensively. That's uncharacteristic and slightly concerning. The good thing is the offensive line looks much improved. Caleb Johnson is finding holes. I think he's got the fourth most production of any running back in the FBS right now. Quarterback play has been inconsistent. It was the second half week 1 for Cade McNamara. It was the first half week 2, and then fell off a cliff in the second half versus Iowa State last week. So at some point they got to find some consistency at that position. But the foundation of Iowa, defense and running the football, is still good enough where I'd take them against most teams in the conference.
It's just hard to believe that it's been as long as it's been since Iowa has had a plug-and-play quarterback, a guy that you put in there and you feel like can do enough to let that defense do its work. I mean, are we going back to maybe Ricky Stanzi as the last guy to really kind of be able to do that for Kirk Ferentz and this team? Because, yes, that defense should and has won them so many games. The offense just needs to give a little bit of consistent help.
The issue in that Iowa State game was the defense at a couple key moments didn't come through. They gave up more than 270 passing yards. So the defense still has to be on point. Again, it has been.
You feel like you can't make any mistakes?
Oh, yeah, it has been the overwhelming percentage of the time through the years. I am encouraged by what you say. Caleb Johnson's run the ball
good
really
running
well.
back.
Offensive line's playing well. So it's just the pass game you've got to get figured out.